Thank you for joining us here on Manufacturing Talk Radio. I'm Tim Grady with Lou Weiss, who is the founder of Manufacturing Talk Radio. And we are doing interviews with the Institute for Supply Management at their conference in Orlando, Florida, which is taking place at the moment, and posting those interviews on our website. And some very exciting things, and one in particular that you should pay attention to is our interview with Credit Risk Monitor. It might wake you up, it might scare you to death, Lou.
I took a Valium a little while ago, so I think I'll be okay. Interesting stuff, and we really will enjoy Tom Derry, CEO of the Institute Supply Management, who you and I know for about 10 years. And great organization. It's been around since 100 and some odd years. The J. Shipman Award was started in 1931, which they are going to have the award winner today. And actually, we will be interviewing that gentleman. So stick around and listen to what everybody's got to say. It's a wild and woolly place that we're living in right now.
It certainly is. And so, as Lou said, stay tuned. Next up is Tom Derry. That will be our kickoff interview, and followed by two others that we're doing. And if we can get some other interviews posted, we'll get those up as well. But thanks for joining us here on Manufacturing Talk Radio in our interviews for the Institute for Supply Management Conference in Orlando, Florida. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Manufacturing Talk Radio. I'm Tim Grady. I'm here with co-host Lou Weiss. Lou's the founder of Manufacturing Talk Radio. We're really excited to talk about the Institute for Supply Management's conference that's going on in Orlando, Florida. They're something like their 70th year after 107 years as an institution. And Tom Derry is joining us. He is the CEO. Tom, welcome back again to Manufacturing Talk Radio. We love having you.
Thanks, Tim. I love being on the program.
How many years are you doing the president thing?
That goes back quite a while. We've been privately briefing the White House and the Federal Reserve Board on our economic data probably for a couple of decades. Yeah. It turns out that we're about the only thing you could describe as a real-time indicator in economics. And even the federal government knows that they don't have data that tells them what's happening at any given moment in the economy, but they rely on ISM for it. It's actually quite a prestigious responsibility and kind of influential responsibility. And we take that very seriously, obviously.
We've heard many times that the president sits there waiting at 10 o'clock in the morning, waiting for the ISM number to come out.
Yeah, that's correct. The Council of Economic Advisors walks a one-page summary into the president at 10 a.m. on the day of release, and it summarizes what they think the important things he needs to know about the direction of the U.S. economy.
And I've been following it for about 40 years also, and it's in sync with our regular business, All Metals and Forge Group, and we always are right in sync with one another. So that's why you're here.
Well, and that's why we do it, right? I mean,
yes.
We're very proud of the influence we have with, the government and policymakers, but ultimately it's a report produced by business people for business people to help them calibrate their supply strategies. And I constantly kind of educate our membership and others about how to use the report. One of the really interesting correlations, there are a couple I can mention, but we track changes in lead times, and then we can track changes in the price levels that are being reported by members at the same time. And it's quite clear that when you see lead times beginning to creep up, prices are going to follow right after that, right? Because there's been a surge in aggregate demand across the economy, and everyone's on allocation, right? And when you see lead times decrease, you can predict that prices are going to fall. You obviously can tell in real time how the U.S. GDP is growing and in what direction, how fast. And we correlate very well to the CPI. Well, so at the macroeconomic level, it's highly valuable to business people.
So now that this is 2022, and we've been involved in COVID for a number of years, how's the show going?
Well, actually, we're thrilled. We've got well over 1,000 people here.
Is that right?
Yeah, and not as big as what we have done in the past, but we're back and we're building towards that. The energy in the conference is incredible because everyone is excited, to see their friends, to see their colleagues, to interact in person. Everyone's so tired of Zoom, and it's clear that I would expect going forward that business travel is resuming now, even to Europe, fairly frequently. So I think we're getting back, and as resilient and as innovative as we have been during the pandemic to deal with the many issues that we had to confront. Right, so commodity shortages, massive inflation in the value chain, logistic problems all around the globe, global trade disputes, all of those things that we've had to navigate. The ability we did them in isolation. Right. So the ability to get with people and compare strategies and talk about how did you handle that? That's invaluable. So in many ways, it's perfect timing. I mean, many people suggest that we're not really out of the woods yet. We've probably got another year or two of serious supply challenges in the global economy. And so the timing to get together, talk, compare notes really couldn't be better for most of the people here in attendance.
So I'm going to get right to it. The Ukrainian war.
Yeah.
How is that affecting the Institute of Supply Management issues?
Well, I mean, we're tracking a lot of the commodities that are crucial from that region of the world. So as you probably know, 25 to 30% of the world's supply of wheat is exported from both Russia and Ukraine. A little bit more obscure is the knowledge that critical gases used for the manufacture of semiconductors like xenon are sourced. They're an industrial byproduct from steelmaking, but a large supply of the world's supply is sourced from the Ukraine. So that's not available right now. People saw the buildup of the likelihood of military hostilities there and anticipated that, and so they brought in some inventory for those gases. So from what I understand, the semiconductor industry is fine for now. And then in food, the other very important commodity that people tend not to know much about is sunflower oil. 80% of the world's sunflower oil comes from Ukraine. And sunflower is hugely important in all sectors of food and beverage manufacturing. It's got a higher smoke point than oil, so it's a lot easier to use. It's lower in cholesterol and fats, and so it's neutral in taste. So it's a very good product, very commonly used product in all kinds of processed foods and cooked foods, and that's beginning to bite for sure.
One of the interesting things that I heard about 2 weeks ago was that the United States government relieved Ukraine of steel tariff. And I thought that it was kind of ironic in view of the fact that they're not making any steel.
Yeah.
Not to talk politics.
Not to talk politics, yeah, but that seemed like a gesture, really.
Right. Tim, I think I interrupted you. What's up?
Sorry. I was going to ask Tom, Tom, we've worked with you for a decade. And as you know, all of us being around the same age group, that the procurement area supply chain was, usually some back office down in the basement work area that really wasn't in the forefront. You never, ever heard about it in the mainstream news. We've been pushing on it now heavily for almost 10 years. You have to be thrilled that in the last 6 months, you actually hear the talking head saying supply chain.
Yeah. We think it's long overdue, right? We would maintain that companies have competed on the basis of their supply chain for all of the 21st century, right? That going back into the late 1990s when the WTO was first created, and the euro was introduced in 1999, all these seminal macroeconomic events that created the conditions that allowed globalization and the growth of globally extended supply chains. We think companies recognized it. They had to get their cost of goods sold down. They had to operate in low-cost countries in order to remain competitive. So we think that's been true for a long time. The The major difference is that in that same time period, we had a broad consensus around the benefits of international trade and opening new markets, and we had a lack of geopolitical conflict, right? Remember the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, and for 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, they essentially had a global consensus on the benefits of international trade. And then you begin to see signs of that fracturing. You know, I could point to the Brexit vote in 2016 in England, which was really a reaction of UK citizens to the fact that jobs that, you know, weren't going to English citizens or UK citizens were going to other people from the continent, from the EU. So that was a dissatisfaction. Then the Trump administration introduced its tariff regime, which, as you know, is still in place under the Biden administration. And that kind of, you know, the way I think of it, it sort of weaponized tariffs again. Tariffs had fallen out of favor, were a commonly used tool in that period of consensus that I talked about. And then when the Trump administration sort of made it okay for states to introduce tariffs to protect their interests, then you saw companies like, you know, so Japan and South Korea have a political dispute going on right now around going back to even to the roots of World War I, dealing with the use of conscript labor and so-called comfort women. It's a purely political dispute that Japan maintains has been set by treaty, and you know it's ancient history and all water under the bridge now from their point of view. But South Korea has been unhappy and has been raising the issue again. And Japan finally said, no, enough's enough, and imposed export restrictions on critical technologies that South Korea needs for making semiconductors, for making LCD panels. So politics is back as a factor in international trade. And so we've got the war in Ukraine, that geopolitical tension and international trade tension between the United States and China, between China and Australia. You're seeing other countries beginning to chafe at the international regime. I'm not saying we're going back to the pre-globalization era. I'm just saying that the pendulum is moving a little in that direction, and some of the issues that have arisen from pursuing globalization to the extent that we have are now being confronted, and countries want a little more control. The other thing that became exposed by the pandemic was the level of interdependency we all have in the global economy. And governments, I think, were largely, you know, I think in private industry, we were clearly aware, because these are our suppliers, right? We know how it works. But I think government was largely unaware of the degree of dependency, and they're very uncomfortable with it, right? They're very uncomfortable with the idea that we might be dependent on rival nations for critical raw materials that we need for our military systems, that we need for our high-tech equipment, that we need for our active pharmaceutical ingredients in our medicines. So the idea of economic and national security has crept back into the conversation around how do we structure international trade in a way that we can maintain a secure environment for our citizens. And we haven't found the answer yet, but I think part of it will be some, I won't say reshoring, but nearshoring, I think for sure is happening. I know that from ISM research. And I think we'll see some regionalization and probably an effort to work with friendly countries to become an alternative source of some of these critical things where we're uncomfortable if we don't have access to them. You know, there is some precedent. China in 2010 imposed export restrictions on rare earth minerals because they have a back to monopoly in the world supply of rare earth minerals, mostly because they're willing to dig mines for them, and many other countries are not. But they were unhappy with the prices they were getting for those minerals on the global market, and so they imposed export restrictions to try to manage up the price. And that case went before the WTO in 2014, and China lost. Now, it's kind of old history, but I mentioned it because there's a precedent for China using its leverage in the international trade system to exact its will, right? And in the current environment, it wouldn't surprise me if push came to shove that China would do something similar to try to take control of its own destiny.
Could very well be. You are there at the conference. You're talking with people about what has happened over the last 2 years. I've always been curious, since we're on the periphery, for the supply chain executive and their staff, how challenging was it over the last 2 years, Tom?
It's been running around with your hair on fire for 2 years. I hear from people who've been in the field for 30 or 40 years saying, never has there been a time period like this. I mean, I don't think it's overstating it. Listen, in my family, my wife is a registered nurse. My daughter's a registered nurse. I have a daughter-in-law who's a registered nurse, and I have a daughter-in-law who's a doctor. But first of all, I can have no fun whatsoever, right?
Yeah, right.
But secondly, they were on the front lines. My one daughter-in-law was in a cardiac ICU, saw horrible, terrible things. My daughter-in-law was a doctor. Because family members couldn't go into the hospital in San Francisco where she works, she would have to sit bedside and hold the hands of dying patients just to give them some human presence in those final moments of their life. So I saw horrible things. And I'm not minimizing any of that heroic effort, but I think in many ways, in a more hidden way, people in supply chain were as heroic, and they literally kept companies up and running, kept people employed, and kept economies running because they figured out a way to get parts moving and components and assemblies and keep production lines up, despite all the many challenges that we faced. And I don't think that should be underestimated. I think they deserve recognition for the heroic efforts they went to on behalf of their own companies and their countries. And there's been some permanent changes, I think. Clearly, the last 30 years in the supply chain was dominated by the topic of cost. And I think two things are creeping into the conversation because of the pandemic primarily, but also because of the war. One is around the idea of risk. We've seen so many disruptions and shortages in all categories. When you look at the ISM report every month, it's not just copper or not just electronic components. It's corrugated glass, it's PCB boards, it's resins and polyethylenes, it's aluminum. It's everything you need in an economy to make anything. And that's a very unusual situation. So the idea that I may not be clear to build if I'm a manufacturer, or I may not be able to ship product and I may have a stock out on store shelves. I certainly know companies who believe they have one permanent market share from their competitors because their supply chains performed and their competitors experienced stockouts, right? So the idea of risk, meaning I could lose market share, right? Permanent market share. As a CEO, I'm thinking my competitive positioning as a firm is definitely impacted by the performance of my supply chain. That's kind of a new realization at the C level and at the board level. So that's one permanent change. And the CPOs I talk to tell me price almost isn't a consideration in 2022. I'm willing to pay what I need to pay to get what I have to have. So it's assurance of supply, it's continuity of supply. That's the primary mission of procurement and supply chain today in 2022. Price is secondary. And then the third thing that's crept into the conversation, so we're willing to accept some trade-offs between risk assurance, risk mitigation and price. And the other thing is sustainability, because we realize that we could lose market share because we have stockouts. We also could lose market share because our customers are unhappy with the way we manufacture our products. And that's real, and that's not changing. So the two major shifts in psychology, I could point to a third, but the two most important ones are the idea that we have to price risk in to our modeling and our assumptions, and that we have to do this in a sustainable way because our customers expect it, our employees expect it, and climate change is real. We recognize it because of the severe weather we're having around the globe, and something has to be done in a short period of time. So the clock is ticking on that. So those two things are definitely much more part of the integral mission of supply chain than they were just 2 years ago.
Well, Tom, excuse me, I want to jump in here for a second, and then I'll throw it to you. But to your point, Tom, about the healthcare professional being on the front lines, certainly right in front of them was the supply chain professional who had to figure out, where am I getting the PPE? Where am I getting the needles, the syringes, the tubing? And every month I do the hospital report with Nancy LeMaster, who's your committee chair. And it's fascinating to have that discussion because it's a challenging area to be in. You don't realize when a pandemic hits, the first place it hits is the emergency rooms of the hospital.
And one of the sort of paradoxes of that particular situation is we thought of those as mostly low value, low cost and low value, latex gloves and surgical gowns and all of the items you mentioned. And so we pushed them to, low cost providers, and that did two things. One was that the margins became so low that only a handful of companies are willing to work right in that space. So we concentrated supply, and we considered them to be, we'll always be able to get latex gloves, right? Well, you can't deliver healthcare, especially in a pandemic, without them. So don't think of them as low value. Think of them, no gloves, no healthcare. I mean, they're absolutely essential, right? My friend Tom Nash, who's the CPO of the American Red Cross, told me a pretty impressive story. In January of 20, he could see signs in his supply chains at the American Red Cross that said, we're not going to be able to get the gloves we need for their blood business. So as you might know, the American Red Cross sells about $2 billion worth of blood and plasma products to American hospitals so they can deliver healthcare to patients. So if the American Red Cross is unable to draw blood from people who donate the blood, hospitals won't have the blood to be able to take care of patients. He said, we got a big problem with the American Red Cross can't get latex gloves. And so they put a take or pay contract in place with their suppliers and said, we're guaranteeing you the volume. We want you to secure manufacturing capacity now, because in 2 months' time, we're not going to be able to find gloves and we need them. And they went to the CFO and said, we're going to buy a boatload of gloves. It's okay. If we don't use them right away, we're going to put them on shelves because they don't go obsolete. But we don't know our $2 billion blood business goes away, which is a problem for the American Red Cross, but more to the American healthcare system. We don't blood and plasma products to the patients who need it. So that's a good example, a very dramatic example in my mind of how critical those core things are.
Well, being in the supply chain business that I've been in, as well as you and Tim, I'm doing this 60 years.
Wow.
I have, what does that mean?
I mean, that's impressive. You've got a
What is that? Does that mean, oh, wow, it's a lot? It is a lot.
Oh, wow, a lot. That's impressive.
And I have never seen what we have seen over the last 2-3 years.
Yeah.
And my internal feeling is it's not going away anytime soon. Now we have monkeypox. Then it's going to be French poodle pox, and it's just going to continue on and on and on. And it's unfortunate, and if we don't attack and bolster our supply chain methodology, the world's in trouble as it is right now.
I don't disagree. I was doing a separate presentation for a conference earlier this morning, and I opened the chart that showed the incidence of major disruption events in supply chains from 2015 through 2021. So things like factory fires, things like major weather, flooding, and tornadoes, major weather events, all range of disruptions. And the really startling conclusion is that in every single year, the incidence of these different disruptions is increasing.
Yes.
So that's why I agree with you that we're in this for a while, and the logistics situation might resolve itself over time with market forces. I think it will. I don't think the shortages. The dominant factor of the economy over the last 2 years was this massive demand-driven, sort of surge in the need for goods in particular. Right. And that might be moderating a little bit, but it's still high. Of course, now we've got inflation, which is a huge factor. I was looking at some data from the Producer Price Index folks at the Bureau of Labor Statistics last summer, and so the summer of 2021, about July, in aggregate. This is the aggregate prices for goods for intermediate demand. So it's actually all the stuff that moves in the supply chain. It's not the finished goods that you buy at store shelves, right? And so that includes energy costs, labor costs, warehousing costs, plus all the costs of your commodities, your components. It was 60% higher in July of 2021 than it was in July of 2020.
Ooh.
I mean, who's got 60% margins, right? So you had, in a normal situation, you might have a spike in a commodity. Let's say it's copper, and copper is an important component to you, but it might be, you buy a lot of it, but it's also a small part of your cost of goods sold. So you really can't pass that cost on to the customer. You can't justify it. And by the way, I can find another place in my business to offset that cost, at least temporarily. But if I got cost increases on all my commodities, all my inputs, plus I'm paying more for my labor, plus I'm paying more for energy, more for warehousing, more for transportation. There's no place to turn to offset the cost. I have no choice but to pass on higher costs to my customer. And our own data shows that we're accepting those price increases. Normally, there'd be a lot of pushback. Normally, you get expectations, you go in the other direction, prices get continually lower. Not in the current environment. It's a major challenge.
In my business, my primary business, all metals and forge, there was always pushback on price. Even if you gave a customer a lower price than the last time, he'd still push back. But now
that doesn't seem fair.
Well, that was just the way purchasing worked in those days. But now nobody questions the price.
Yeah.
What's the delivery and when am I going to get it?
Yeah.
So it's a big difference today with pricing. It's almost virtually no pushback.
Yeah.
Because they understand, they know what's going on. The people are educated, the manufacturing companies are educated, their CEOs are educated. They know what's going on. They know it's not going to get better. All they need to know is, am I going to get my resources so that I can push my product out?
Yeah, there's one industrial manufacturer I was talking to. I think this is a really good example. Their company goal is to ship on a customer's request date at least 95% of the time, and they normally get it in the 92 to 94% range, so pretty close. They're currently operating at 79% because they can't get the components to be clear to cook.
Yeah.
Normally, only 0.5% of their inputs are past due as they see it. Currently, it's 5 times worse than that. It's about 2.7%.
Yeah.
That translates into 3% of lost revenue per quarter. So on a compound basis, more than 12%. So, and here's the point that I make about that. Up until right about now, the U.S. economy has been very strong. Right, so it's weakened a little bit of late, but it's been quite strong. We've been firing on all cylinders, and it's not that we aren't growing, but these supply constraints. So whether it's labor shortages or commodity shortages, and whatever the issues that we're dealing with, they're holding our growth back from being even faster. So our growth rates would be higher and faster were it not for the challenges we're facing. So when we're operating in an environment where, and by the way, more ISM data shows that not only are companies holding more inventory intentionally to help buffer against production disruptions, they're also holding more inventory unintentionally because that's work in process inventory. It's stuck on a warehouse shelf someplace because they're missing one component and they can't ship to a customer. Nobody wants to hold that. So we're at a very, very unusual time. Now, eventually, the inventory situation, I believe, will resolve. And some people ask, are we permanently moving from just in time to so-called just in case? And I don't think so. I think in the medium term, we're going to get back to lean operations are too ingrained and they make too much sense. The economics are too overwhelming in their favor. But right now, if I'm worried about having supply, I'm going to build some buffer stock.
As many of our customers are doing the same.
Mm-hmm.
I need 20 forgings. Well, you know what? Make it 30.
Yeah, right.
Well, Tom, I really appreciate you taking the time because you are in a busy, hectic environment at that conference. We have been with you in prior years, and just getting you for 10 minutes was a significant challenge because you're kind of like Gumby and everybody's pulling you in different directions and stretching you thin. So thank you for being with us again on Manufacturing Talk Radio.
I wouldn't mind the stretched thin part, I don't think. Great talking with you both, as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we want to
have a good show.
I appreciate it.
We want to remind everybody to go to ismworld.org, which is the website for the Institute for Supply Management. Terrific information there. If you're looking to get into the industry and you want to have some accreditation, they have some wonderful courses that they built some years ago and they keep up. So ismworld.org, and while you're surfing the web, stop by jacketmediaco.com and check out this episode and all the other episodes. And Lou?
I want to remind everybody that we have the ISM report being explained every month by ISM Manufacturing, ISM Services, and ISM Hospital. We do 3 shows a month, the first week of the month, and we've been doing that for 9 years. We keep on doing that. Soon, Tom, you're going to wind up with a yellow jacket.
Well, yellow jacket, green jacket, I could use both, one of each.
No, no green. That was the wrong channel.
All right, thanks, guys.
again. Thanks again.
Okay.
Bye-bye.